So here's the second part of 3 about NIEM IEPDs. In this section, we're going to talk about mapping, that is mapping to the NIEM, creating schemas, and then validating the schemas that we've created. Going back to the IEPD lifecycle diagram, we've taken care of scenario planning and we've looked at analyzing requirements. We're now sort of in that quadrant at 4 and 5 o'clock map and model. Now we've done the modeling, we talked about UML in the previous section. Now we're going to talk about mapping before we move on to building and validating. And then the third part is going to deal with the rest of the cycle. The idea with mapping is to take objects and relationships from your UML, from your exchange content model, and map them to things in the NIEM. And two things will fall out of this. You'll identify things from the NIEM that you need for your exchange, and you'll include them in your subset. Now, if you don't know what a subset is, there is a whole presentation on NIEM XML artifacts that go into an IEPD, and that talks more about what the subset is and how you make them. But it'll also, in addition to identifying the things you need from the NIEM, it'll identify things that aren't in the NIEM. As you go through your exchange content model and look for things in the NIEM, there'll be things that aren't there. And those are things for which you'll need to extend the NIEM to add those additional objects so that you can include them in your exchange. Now, extending the NIEM is also the subject of a different presentation. It's part 5 of the NIEM Advanced Technical Concepts presentation. So that's where you'll go to find out how to extend the NIEM to add new things. To document your mapping, you'll do that in a mapping document. And what's a mapping document? Well, it's a spreadsheet. Now, sometimes they call this a component mapping tool, which is kind of a fancy name for the spreadsheet you use as your mapping document. In this spreadsheet, you'll list all the things in your exchange content model. You'll list all the classes and all the attributes and the various associations. And then each of those objects you'll either map to a NIEM object and list down what NIEM object it was, or you'll mark it as requiring an extension, and maybe you'll add some additional information to help you with the extension later on. Now, the NIEM PMO provides a sample spreadsheet to use, and you can certainly use that, or you can roll your own. I like to roll my own because I find the provided one to be both over-inclusive and under-inclusive. In other words, it contains a lot of stuff in it that I don't need for my mapping, so it just confuses me, plus it's missing things that I wish it had. So I typically roll my own. Generally, with the mapping spreadsheet, each row will represent a concept, and then you'll put the different kinds of information in the different columns, typically how you use a spreadsheet. Now, my philosophy on spreadsheets is simple. Columns are cheap. Use them freely. If you think of a piece of information you want to track about a concept, and there's not a column for it, then add a column for it. Geez, they're columns, they're cheap. Add them to your spreadsheet. Use them freely. In general, the spreadsheet gets organized into 3 groups, or the columns get organized into 3 groups. The first group is the exchange content section, and that's where you actually list the different classes, attributes, and relationships from your UML. Then there's kind of the middle section, which is the NIEM mapping section. That's where you write down what things in the NIEM you found that map to the concepts in that first section. And then the third section is for other stuff, comments, cardinality, documentation, any other kind of things you need in your mapping spreadsheet to help make it clear how you're mapping your UML content model concepts to the NIEM. The first section, the first set of columns, which is the exchange content section, is, well, the information is pulled directly from your exchange content model. And you'll typically have columns for the class name and for attribute names, and then typically people will group attributes under their class. It just sort of makes sense. Some people will put them all in one column. Some people will have a separate column for the class name and then one column over for the attribute because it gives more of a visual separation. Although you can do it either way. Remember, you're going to need to map both the classes and the attributes to things in the NIEM. So if you're going to put the attributes in a second column, make sure the class has a row on its own and start your attributes on the row after that because it'll need to be mapped separately in addition to the things inside of it. You can also include a column for the kind of data for each attribute so that you can know right away that the attribute you're looking for is a string or it's a number or it's a Boolean or whatever it may be. And you can also have a column for the definition if you'd like. That makes it easy to access this definition and compare it to a definition out of the NIEM. So these are all columns that can be in that first section of columns in your mapping spreadsheet. The NIEM mapping section is where you show what each thing in the exchange content model maps to either in the NIEM or as a new element. Now there's lots of potential columns that can go in this section, so many I had to put them on a separate slide. So here are some columns for the mapping section. Now the first one you really need to have. This is the element name. It'll be either something out of the NIEM. If you've mapped your concept to something in the NIEM, it'll be that particular element name in the NIEM to which you've mapped it. Or in the case of something not being in the NIEM and you need to extend the NIEM, this will be the element name for your new element that you'll create to be able to hold the piece of information and the concept that you need. The second is the path in the instance document, and this gives context to the element name. For example, if you've mapped a person's first name to the NIEM's person given name, which is what you should do, you also want to know that that person given name is inside of a person name and that the person name is inside of a person. So typically you would have a path that would say person slash person name slash person given name. The format is kind of like XPath for those of you who are familiar with XML schema and familiar with XPath, although it's not really XPath, it just kind of looks like XPath. But it's basically a pathing information to tell you where this element kind of lives in the context of your document. The next column is the type for the element. Now if it's something out of the NIEM, it could be the type that element is out of the NIEM. And in that case, there's not a real good reason to list it, but there is a good reason to list it if it's a new element. If I'm coming up with a new element and I've got the element name, I also want to put in the type for that element. That type might be a type out of the NIEM itself, so I'm just reusing something out of the NIEM, or it might be a brand new type that I'm going to create. In either case, I'm going to want to list it here. I'm also going to want to have a column for element definitions. Now, I might cut and paste NIEM definitions in when I'm using NIEM elements, or if I'm making a new one, hey, this is where I'll document my definition for my new element. The next column I call derived from type. If I'm making a new element and it's going to have a new type, it's good to document what that new type is going to be derived from. So if I'm making a special sort of citation, so as I'm dealing with a citation, I always like to pick citation because it jumps to mind easily, and I'm making a special citation and I'm going to have a special citation type, I'm going to want to document that I'm going to derive that special citation type from the existing citation type, and that's what I would put in derived from. I'd put the existing citation type so that I know later on what I'm deriving from. And then finally, it's good to have a column saying to what degree a NIEM element matches. Is it an exact match where what I found in the NIEM is exactly what I needed, or is it some sort of partial match where there are things in the NIEM I could use to represent this, but I'm going to have to futz around a little to make it work? Or is there no match at all, in which case these are the cases where I'm making a new element. And the nice thing is, when you have that column that says all that, then later you can reorder your spreadsheet to bunch together all the stuff that you need to create new. So it's a nice way to quickly do that. In the other stuff section, here are some more columns you might want. You might want cardinality columns so that you know how many of a certain thing you're going to have. So for example, if I've got a person name and I'm picking person surname, that's the one I'm actually mapping to, I may want to write down cardinality that that's just one of those. Everybody's going to have a last name in my exchange and nobody's going to have more than one. Or maybe it's going to be optional, whichever you want, but mark down that cardinality in that column. Maybe for a person's middle name, the cardinality is 0 to unbounded. And so I'll put that down so that I know later on when I create my subset, that's how I want the cardinality to look. Or if it's a new element, I'll know what kind of cardinality to put in my extensions. Another column is the extension method, if extending. Now again, we're not talking about the methods here. That's in Section 5 of NIEM Advanced Technical Concepts and talks all about the different ways of extending. And if you're going to be using more than one methodology, which you might depending on your needs, then you're going to want to list down which methodology you're going to use here. Another column for any other notes, and believe me, you'll have other notes. Just kind of a general comments column is a good thing to have because you're always going to have little things that you want to mark down. Another potential column would be hyperlinks to documentation, particularly if the information in your content model comes from somewhere else to which you can link with a hyperlink so that you can click on it and go get more information. Or if you want, this could be links to additional documentation about NIEM elements so that if you're going, boy, what is this NIEM element really like when you look back later, you can quickly jump to see what it looks like. And finally, anything else you can think of that will help understand the mapping you're doing. Remember, columns are cheap. That's my mantra here. Columns are cheap and use them if you need them. If you have more kinds of information to put in a spreadsheet and I haven't mentioned the column yet, so what? Add a column for it. Columns are cheap. So how do you actually, map to the NIEM? Well, you go through each of your concepts from your UML. You've got them all listed in your mapping spreadsheet. You go through each one and you search through the NIEM to find matches. So how do you search through the NIEM? Well, there's a number of tools you can use to do this. One is called NIEM Wayfarer, and I list that first because that's when I wrote, but NIEM Wayfarer is a nice way to search through the model. The SSGT, the subset schema generation tool, also works really well as a means of exploring the model and finding out things in it, searching for things. It actually has more sophisticated advanced searching capabilities than Wayfarer does, so use them both. You can use the NIEM schemas themselves. Lots of people do actually go through the schemas, load them into an editor of some sort, and search for things that way. There are other tools available as well. I'm not going to go through them all in the course of these training materials, but the major ones are Wayfarer and the SSGT, and of course the schemas themselves. Here are some hints for searching the NIEM for different things. Now you might think you just type in what you have and you'll get back what you need, and it's not that simple. For one thing, the NIEM often has different terms for things than you might think. You may be thinking police officer, and instead in the NIEM that's enforcement official. So the NIEM has its own kind of way of referring to things, and if you don't do it exactly right, then you won't find it by doing exact searching. So here are some hints for helping you find the things you need. First, search for stubs. For example, instead of searching for officer, search for OFFIC. Leave the ends of words off. Because if you do this, it'll match officer, it'll match official, it'll match officiate, it'll match all sorts of things that are close to what you want. Search for synonyms. If you don't find the exact term you're looking for, try searching for synonyms. I mean, that's common searching hint stuff, but give it a shot. Look for things your concept might contain. Again, if I'm looking for a police officer and I can't find it, I might look for a badge. And indeed, if you look in the NIEM for a badge, you'll get badge identification, which is inside of the enforcement official type. So you'll actually find what you want that way. Or you can do the converse. Look for things which might contain your concept. So I can't find enforcement official. Maybe I'll look at something that might contain an enforcement official, like, I don't know, a citation. Or, if I was looking for the badge ID and couldn't find it, I could instead search for the officer and find the thing that it's inside of. So that's a way as well. There's something called contextual matching, which has to do with inheritance. Take, for example, a school. The CIFS domain has a school object. And that school object is of a school type in the CIFS domain, which is derived from an organization type in the CIFS domain, which is in turn derived from the NIEM Code's organization type, which means that a school object has a name. But it's not called school name, and instead it inherits organization name. So if I go searching for school name, I'm not going to easily find it. However, some tools, Wayfarer being one of them, provides contextual matching help as well, so that I can search for school name, and if I don't find it in my results, I can look way at the bottom of the screen, where it can let me do a contextual search, which will then give me things that contextually match. And what it'll tell me then is, oh, hey, organization name in the context of a school is what we use instead of school name. It's not 100% accurate, nothing searching wise is, but it does give you a leg up on finding those kind of matches. Finally, related to that, try more abstract terms for your concept. If I was looking for a school name, maybe I want to look for something more generic like an organization, and then I would find what I needed that way. Some of the tools, such as Wayfarer, will let you look at more general types of objects and see a list of everything derived from that. So I can go and look at organization type and get a list of everything that's either of organization type or of a type derived from organization type, thereby giving me a list of all the organizational-ish type objects in the NIEM. And so that's another way to find the things you're looking for. There is a golden rule of mapping, and that's to use NIEM objects when they match your concepts, but only when they match your concepts. It's also important to include the hierarchy if possible. For example, don't use person name out on its own. Use it inside of a person object. Now, sometimes you can't do that. There are pieces you're going to want to pull and put into something else because conceptually in your business, that piece belongs there instead of where it is in the NIEM. But in general, you want to include hierarchies if possible. The converse is don't use NIEM objects when they don't match your concept. Don't go thinking, this is kind of close to what I mean, so I'll just use this. Because when you do that, you corrupt the semantic integrity of the model, and that's a bad thing to do. When people get a certain NIEM object from you, they expect it to conform to the definition in the NIEM. And if you're using it for something close but not quite, then you're going to have problems with information exchange. Because what they'll be assuming that piece of information means may be different from what you're assuming that piece of information means because you're not following the definition in the NIEM. So the golden rule, use NIEM objects when they match, but don't use them when they don't.